Right. What I want to try and do in this video is just give an overview of the paper and show how it links to other work which has come before and which is currently ongoing. Obviously, most of the credit must go to Daniel King, who expertly led this work as part of his MSc. Thanks also to Louise and Rue for their valuable input throughout as well. Please don't expect this to be an in-depth overview of the paper. For that, you can obviously read it. There's a QR code here that you can follow to get straight to it. Just as a brief bit of background, if you're not familiar, we know from lots of work that ratio of forces, which is the orientation of the ground reaction force vector in the sagittal plane, as you can kind of see here from J.B. Morin's early work, we know it's important for acceleration performance. And there's a nice study from Robita and colleagues which shows that it's this orientation of the force vector rather than its magnitude, which is what separates the elite from the sub-elite sprinters during acceleration. So what we aim to do in this paper was ultimately to try and determine if there were any relationships between selected kinematic characteristics that we might often see, look for, quantify during acceleration, and that ratio of forces, because that's not been determined before. I guess over the last few years, I've had quite a few thoughts about this and conversations with many of the other people whose names you'll see on various studies that I'll refer to in this presentation, but never the right data really to confirm or deny them. So this was a chance to actually just directly assess what's a very simple question, but just to understand whether there were those specific kinematic aspects, and if so, to start trying to understand them. So, as I said, we did a very simple study. We took a group of collegiate level male sprinters, so PBs ranging from about 10.6 to 11.6. Obviously lucky to collaborate with Rue and get the ground reaction force data from the first 4 steps after block clearance we used, and then their kinematics from marker-based motion capture over those same 4 steps. Okay, getting straight into the results, probably the sort of headline result, as expected, but it's not really been demonstrated before, was the importance of touchdown distance. So touching down with the foot further behind the center of mass or less far in front of it as the steps progress was related to a higher ratio of forces. And that confirmed experimentally across this cross-section of sprinters a general trend that we've shown previously with our kind of single 10-2 sprinter using a simulation model. So you can see that same relationship between touchdown distance and ratio of forces on the 2 plots there. Now, there is a bit of caution we need to apply to considering it this simply, but I'll hold that thought and I'll come back to that one later on. Okay, linking this into literature then, I think it extends nicely from, in my opinion, what's one of the best papers still on sprint acceleration technique, where Jacobs and Van Ingenschnau proposed the need to rotate before extending during early acceleration. And perhaps this touchdown distance is a way of reducing that necessary initial requirement for rotation by landing in a better position. But how do we do that? Because touchdown distance is a function of kind of many configurations across the body. The center of mass path is fixed once the athlete's in flight in each step. So the primary way of affecting touchdown distance is to manipulate the kinematics of the leg swinging into touchdown. So we didn't look at the leg during the swing phase, but at the instant of touchdown, and we looked at all of the lower limb joint and segment angles. And the 2 that we found were related to RF was landing with a more forward orientated proximal end of both the foot and the shank. So as you can see here, the further the foot angle is from 180 degrees, so the less flat the foot, as you can see in the middle there, and the lower the shank angle, so the more the top end is leaning forwards, the higher the ratio of forces. So we know touchdown distance is important for the generation of a higher average ratio of forces during these initial acceleration stance phases. And these results demonstrate the importance of configuration of the foot and the shank at touchdown in helping to enable this. It also confirms some of our previous experimental work on amateur team sports athletes And in combination, we think it's likely then that the foot and shank are kind of helping to control that direction of force production, even if a lot of the force production itself is largely driven by those more proximal regions. Now, one important observation was that the ankle angle at touchdown wasn't related to RF. So we think the shank angle is primarily one of the important ones here, confirming what's common in coaching circles around those often viewed shin angles. But a well-positioned kind of forward rotated shin probably won't be as effective if the foot is also not playing its part underneath that. And continuing on that theme of ankle joint kinematics, we also look beyond the instant of touchdown into the stance phase. And interestingly, the amount of dorsiflexion at the ankle during early stance, which we know happens in all steps for all levels of athlete, was also related to RF. More dorsiflexion was associated with a higher RF. And if we think back to that Jacobs and Van Ingenschnau paper, potentially this is another way through which that rotation strategy can be achieved from touchdown onwards. So if the touchdown distance isn't as effective as it could be, or we're getting in through later steps, that initial rotation, which potentially links with the shin roll concept recently discussed in sports biomechanics by Toby Out and colleagues, whereby the shank is proposed as needing to rotate about a relatively stationary foot, that could be part of what we're seeing here. Now, we can't determine this from ankle angle alone, which is what we've looked at in this paper. And it raises some questions around the need to better understand the very broad concept, really, of ankle stiffness. And perhaps this is where we need to start unpicking the technical and the physical or the neuromuscular elements of this dorsiflexion strategy a bit more. And maybe this is where coordination analysis can actually start to help us. So I just want to introduce here some interesting work going on at the moment in this space as part of Byron's PhD. And this is where we can look at how the rotations of each of those two segments are coupled and how the foot and shank are hopefully coordinated in making sure that dorsiflexion during the early part of stance is ideally a forwards movement of the knee due to rotation of the shank, rather than a drop of the heel due to rotation of the foot. And there's plenty more coming in this space as Byron looks at the sprinter's own constraints, such as their strength and how that might influence this. And there's obviously lots of other unknowns and things we must be aware of too. We probably need to consider a more complex model of the foot. And we mustn't forget that in many sprint scenarios, acceleration isn't the be all and end all. And limiting dorsiflexion might become progressively more important as we approach max velocity sprinting. Again, all things to keep us kind of busy as we look to understand this more moving forwards. Okay. If we do just stick to acceleration performance in isolation, though, for the purposes of what I'm talking about now, obviously the goal is a powerful start, not just a high RF, because we want to make sure we're looking for factors which improve performance, not just one factor which contributes towards performance. So it's important to see how these kinematics relate to the power production during initial acceleration. And if you want justification for why we're using external power, you can have a read of this old paper, but hopefully kind of it will make sense if you've seen this work before. When we looked at relationships with performance, only touchdown distance, if I change the plot on the screen there, we've now got power production on the y-axis. Only touchdown distance was significantly related to performance. And the foot and shank angles in isolation were no longer significantly related to performance like they were to RF. So what we think this is suggesting is probably that the right interaction or combination of segment orientations is needed to achieve a good touchdown distance. And simply striving or focusing on a good position of a single segment in isolation may not necessarily be beneficial for RF, or maybe even for performance if the other ones aren't working in effective combination with it. Now, based on a lot of good ecological dynamics theory, have a look at some of Altis's recent posts or Stu McMillan's ones on Twitter, or the recent short course for more about applying that to acceleration, as well as some recent evidence from James Wild's PhD, where we saw different sprint acceleration technical strategies leading to equivalent levels of performance outcomes. So these 4 sort of different colored strategies on the blobs on the screen here, falling into different areas of this kind of spatial map of people's technique. It's clear that there are different sprint acceleration strategies which can lead to equivalent levels of performance outcome. So there's different details to the ways in which people can accelerate effectively. So we probably need to better explore and understand the additional technical or physical features which might be required in order to help translate a change in a particular kinematic variable and in RF to a change in performance. And this is where James's work continued to go. He can do a much better job talking about that than me. So have a look on his Twitter feed for much more info on it, and keep an eye out, hopefully, for some more papers of his in the future, or dig into his PhD thesis, which you can find on ResearchGate. As I said, I just want to close the loop back to an earlier point about caution that I raised. And we know from these current data and kind of previous modeling work, this relationship between touchdown distance and ratio of forces. But we know that within a given individual, placing the foot too far back, yes, it continues to increase RF. But if we look at the other half of that figure from the paper, performance, the power output starts to drop off, because the overall horizontal impulse that can be produced is negatively affected. We don't see that quite so clearly across the cross-section in the current paper. And it's probably more a case of each athlete having their own individual optimum given their current sort of physical and technical constraints. If we do fit a curve, we didn't do this in the paper, it wasn't part of it, but you can see a slight kind of curvilinear trend here. And I think what this sort of inverted U relationship is suggesting is that we should be careful of just striving for that continually sort of posterior touchdown distance. We shouldn't be striving to keep pulling the foot back as far as possible. In simple terms, I guess it's synonymous with that Goldilocks effect. A foot too far forwards, but also too far backwards for a given individual could lead to decreased performance. And it's finding that right middle ground for the athlete. I'll put the main findings just back up on here in summary. Obviously, if you're interested, please do have a look at the paper where we discuss it all in a lot more detail. Please do get in touch with me. You can see my details on the bottom. And we're looking at ways to now better understand this whole link between the kind of shin rotation, the heel drop, the ankle stiffness function, and understanding kind of what impacts what and potentially which is the driving factor behind RF and performance. As I said, it was a simple study. We have to be aware of limitations, as there is with all research, and careful with what we conclude from this kind of correlation-based research. We'd like a more complex foot model. We've only looked at this in college-level sprinters, all male. We didn't look at joint kinetics, where clearly the moment and power profiles at the ankle and probably the MTP are quite important. And again, we've not focused on the swing leg in this, which could well influence both the center of mass kinematics, the subsequent touchdown kinematics, and even RF itself, as well as other non-sagittal movements that might be of interest. So as you can hopefully appreciate, still lots to do and hopefully lots of ideas for future research, but hopefully this paper gives at least a sort of a bit more evidence that helps us get that bit further towards a more complete understanding of acceleration mechanics.